I don't know about you, but I already feel cold, and winter has hardly started here. If you go into the freezing depths of Labour's flagship policy on winter fuel payments, of course, it's going to get even bleaker, the bleak midwinter. And Sir Keir Starmer today, this evening, has proclaimed that his decision to restrict the payments to pensioners receiving pension credit makes sense. But does it really? For a man with a legal background, his argument is surprisingly thin on both morality and practicality. When it comes to the law, of course, he's now got the precedent that if the government doesn't like something, it can just create another law to make green, red, or whatever they want. This is what Suella Braverman, another person with a strange background in law, has actually contributed to Westminster. The cuts, intended to save £1.4 billion annually, will strip 10 million retirees of up to £300 in winter support. While targeted support may seem logical, Labour's own research under Jeremy Corbyn found that nearly half a decade-long reduction in excess winter deaths was due to universal winter fuel payments. Starmer now risks reversing that progress, pushing up to 100,000 pensioners into poverty by 2026, many of whom are already living precariously close to the breadline. And it's another case of, if you want to do this, do it, but ease it in incrementally over a period of a few years. Instead, it's done with this knee-jerk attitude, so people suddenly find that they don't have that winter fuel support as winter is approaching. It's not only not thinking ahead, it's spiteful. It's vicious. And Starmer insists that many pensioners are relatively wealthy and don't need the payment. That paints a dangerously reductive picture. A retired couple in modest circumstances might not qualify for pension credit, yet they still struggle to heat their home. With the skyrocketing energy costs, and Starmer's wealth is a subjective concept, and his blanket exclusion policy ignores the complexity of older people's financial situations, from unexpected health costs to the impact of inflation on fixed incomes. Means testing creates administrative barriers for those who need support most. The amount of times that I have dealt with PIP forms and seriously wanted to scream at the questions. It's a bureaucratic barrier. And unless you know what the questions are, how you're supposed to answer the questions to get the result, what answer do you give? It's a significant portion of eligible pensioners, estimated at 1 million, do not claim pension credit because of the stigma, the complexity, the lack of awareness. Starmer's assumption, because of the frustration of trying to get through those forms, and Starmer's assumption that these individuals will suddenly take up benefits to retain the winter fuel payment is at best naive, patronising, at worst, reckless. Age UK warns that many elderly people, particularly those with high energy needs, will simply fall through the cracks, quite literally. Labour's claim that this policy is necessary to fund the NHS and schools is disingenuous. By forcing pensioners into colder homes, they risk exacerbating cold-related illnesses such as hypothermia, strokes, and respiratory conditions, particularly with a very nasty flu or a new form of COVID going round. It's laid me flat for 6 to 8 weeks. And this will inevitably place additional strain on an already overstretched NHS, an ironic outcome for a policy allegedly designed to protect public services. If Starmer really wants to help the NHS, or education. He needs to get rid of the useless bureaucrats who are taking up space and taking up the biggest pay packets and offering nothing that's actually beneficial. For a party that champions social justice, the decision feels uncomfortably cold-hearted. The universality of the winter fuel payment has always been its strength. It recognises that every pensioner, regardless of exact income, deserves dignity and security in their later years. Removing it undermines that principle and risks framing Labour as detached from the lives of ordinary people. Starmer's smug defence of this policy today is costing him politically. Recent polls show his popularity plummeting, with Labour trailing the Conservatives in voter intention. Well, you know, he's got another 4 years to go before he has to present himself at the general election at the polls. But pensioners, traditionally less inclined to vote Labour, are hardly likely to be won over by policies that risk their health, their warmth. And if they want that warmth, if they want that handout, they have to go begging. What Starmer fails to see is the opportunity to reform a system without harming vulnerable pensioners. A more nuanced approach, such as taxing winter fuel payments for higher earners, could have achieved savings while maintaining universal eligibility. Instead, Labour has opted for blunt austerity disguised as pragmatism, disguised as helping the NHS and schools. So Keir Starmer's claims that his government must be, quote, willing to be unpopular is again disingenuous. He's doing a great number of things early on in his administration so that he can then relax like the new teacher in the school, tough, and then relax into being adored. But pensioners, those who survive the winter, will have a long memory, like farmers, like those parents who have scrimped and saved to provide an opportunity for their children who should be recognised in the STEM system and aren't because the bureaucracy, the documentation is too complex and takes too long. And they found space in smaller private schools that are now going bust or have jacked their prices up so much that it's unaffordable. And yet Starmer, along with many people in his cabinet, can move into affluent areas where the school catchment system offers their children a better state school education. That's all people want. A better opportunity. And this arrogance of assuming that there's a difference between people who pay for it in private education and people who go to the local state school. There isn't really. The state schools all have different qualities. And to move into an area where there is a good state school requires money. You either buy a house and then play the champagne socialist, or you scrimp and save and you put your children into a good private school where you can be sure their needs will be met. And the fantasy which is peddled that private schools are going to provide some sort of networking opportunity, are a place where superiority, elitism is encouraged. The people who are saying this have never been to these schools. I've taught in them. I've taught in private schools, I've taught in state schools, I've taught in schools in other countries. And there's very little difference today between a state school and a private school. In fact, in many ways, state school teaching is often better. The facilities are where they exist in the good catchment areas are better. And then in the bad catchment areas, they're appalling. and the school classrooms are falling to pieces. But you'll find school classrooms falling to pieces in the private sector as well. No one talks about that. Doesn't seem to be very popular to mention that. I remember when I was little, I went through a number of private schools. And when I was very young, I was in a dormitory with windows that didn't shut, and there was often snow on the end of my bed. I didn't experience that again until I was teaching in Russia. And the only way to cool down the centrally heated rooms that I was given was to open the window. And the snow blew in, and it reminded me of when I was much younger. So Keir Starmer, this idea of being unpopular, but unpopularity is not a virtue when it comes from bad policy and poor leadership. And choosing to be unpopular is not necessarily a choice about doing something right. It's a choice simply about being unpopular. And pensioners are not just a line on a spreadsheet. They're people whose lives and well-being depend on thoughtful governance. And like parents, like children in schools, they had plans, and they planned on the money, the budget that they had prepared. And Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have, in a knee-jerk series of decisions, taken all that away. So Keir Starmer's winter fuel payment cuts are a policy misstep, I think, wrapped in misplaced confidence, in a fantasy that what is taken from Peter can be given to Paul. It's not that at all. What is taken from Peter is given to John, or Jenny, or Granny Smith, up in the NHS England, these pen pushers who you don't see in the hospitals. They're the people raking it in. So let's hope, as the frost bites harder, that the Labour leader learns to thaw his icy approach, because he risks being left out in the political cold.